Hey everybody, this is Gary Smith, that's Kaz Kenny, I am Eddie Bramble, and this is episode 6 of the Blackwaters Edge podcast. And today we have Josh Newhard here from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Josh, how you doing today?
Good, how you guys doing?
Good. So Josh, for our audience, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself real quick?
I'm Josh Newhard. I'm a fish biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're based out of Annapolis, Maryland. I don't actually work directly for the refuge here. Of course, over here by Blackwater, of course, there's a National Wildlife Refuge where we're going to be talking about today. But I work with Snakehead. I've worked there for almost 11 years now. Apart from Snakehead, we work with striped bass, American eel, horseshoe crab, a whole suite of things.
Fantastic. So today we're going to talk about the study you and Joe Love did inside the Blackwater Refuge on snakeheads and the other fish populations being affected by the snakeheads introduction.
Yeah. So it was actually a study that we did about 12 years ago. We did a fish community survey because there was going to be a weir installed in the upper part of the Blackwater River. So that was a totally different purpose of why we were going to do it. We did 2 years of survey data. We were supposed to survey in 2006 for a year, then they were going to install the weir, and then we were survey after. Unfortunately, construction got delayed, but we still did the survey in 2007, and we looked at the fish community with the hopes of seeing how it might change following the installation of that water control structure. So you fast forward 12 years later, snakeheads were first reported from Blackwater and at least officially reported in 2012. And, so we kept our eye on it, but then we get reports from the refuge. They start saying, hey, when we drain our impoundments, we got hundreds of snakehead in here. And then you hear reports of people just running down Key Wallace, catching hundreds of fish. Maybe not all in a day, but pretty routinely. You got people going down there catching 5, 6 and going again catching 5, 6. And I was like, well, there must be a lot of snakeheads over there. And, we've, of course, had the same concerns wherever snakeheads have shown up, but this kind of gave us the first opportunity to say, well, hey, we got some actual fish community data before snakeheads showed up, so let's go see what the fish community looks like now. And it looks like, we've seen some differences, of course. A lot of species were reduced in abundance. That was one of the big takeaways. And then the species that were dominant in our 2006, 2007 surveys switched. White perch and brown bullhead were some of our most abundant species, whereas now it's common carp and gizzard shad. So
that's interesting.
We can we talk about that.
Okay, so Kaz, what are your thoughts on the survey? How much have you read on the survey so far?
I mean, I think they've done a great job with what they're doing, and I think that to continue what we're doing is the answer, and I think that's what we're going to do, right? Continue to monitor a little bit and keep an eye on things, and I think they've done a great job. I think that there's a lot of questions the community has that we need to get some answers to, or at least some kind of conclusion to, so that we can, help people rest assured that we're doing the right thing, and that, we do need to be the ambassador that makes a difference to the waterway, so to say, in my opinion. You know what I mean? Like I've been saying, if you see something, say something. You all have seen me kick and scream down here for a couple years, you know what I mean? So if you got something going on up where you are, start kicking and screaming, start calling people, start raising the flags, you know what I mean? If you don't see something concerning, then make your own decision, I guess. But in all reality, I mean, we have to do something. I think that this survey shows that. I mean, that's my personal opinion.
So, Josh, give us a quick rundown. So what were some of the procedures you guys used for conducting this survey?
So we followed the exact same thing we did in 2006, 2007. So basically, we sampled every month. Back then, we did sample every week during the spring because we were trying to get a handle on the river herring return, if that was going to happen. But so that was a little bit different. We didn't sample weekly this time. But anyway, we went out every month. We set fyke nets. We had 3 sets, 3 sites in the Little Blackwater River, 3 sites in the Blackwater River. And we tried at same sites, same exact locations that we sampled in 2006, 2007. And if you don't know what a fyke net is, it's kind of like a pound net. It's set from perpendicular to shore. Basically, you set a pole in shore, you back out, you set the net. Fish hit that net, and then they got to swim through a series of hoops, and then they eventually get traps. We set it pretty much for 24 hours at a time. And, it's pretty non-selective. It won't catch the tiniest of fish because they can fit through the mesh, but it'll catch just about anything in that general area as long as it's, swimming by and hits the net. So it's unique in that there's somewhat less bias with a lot of other methods. And it's also, Blackwater is unique to use one in because, of course, you set, a pound net in a deep water river. if you set it on the shore, you're just going to catch fish in the shoreline. You're not going to catch those fish that are in the deep channel, which, that doesn't really exist out here. So, relatively speaking,
Not in the Blackwater system.
deep is a relative term.
If you
out
fall
here,
over and you can't stand, you ain't on the eastern shore.
Right.
It's not deep unless you're a gecko.
So so every day we'd once a month we'd come out the next day, we'd pull the nets, dump them into our tubs, count the fish, ID them, and throw them back in the water. And we just do that. We did it for a year. Most recently, we did it from June 2018 to May 2019. We did miss a month due to icing and stuff, but
you did it once a month.
Once a month.
Okay. And were you part of the 06 and 07 surveys?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you worked on both of them. Okay.
Right. Yep.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So it was different. Yeah, we had kind of seen this when we started in 1819. It was like I just remember filling up tubs. We used to fill up. You can imagine like an 18-gallon tote. Like you might store clothes in. That was kind of what we'd use, about that size box, and we'd routinely fill that up with fish, years ago, and that just didn't happen this year, which was something odd. We took it as like whatever, it is what it is. We'll keep sampling, try not to make too many conclusions, and we analyzed the data, and it was significantly different. The 5 of the 6 sites, like the report shows, were significantly different than they were. Mainly that's driven by the species that were making it up, as well as the reduction in abundance of those species.
So before we get too deep into it, I've had a couple guys ask me before, how easy is it to catch snakeheads in nets? Because I've heard before that, I don't know how accurate this is or not, that because of their mucus coating, it makes them a little bit easier to escape out of those nets. So
I don't think they're going to escape the fyke net. I mean, we caught about 130 over the year at all our sites, so that's not a lot, right? I mean, we could have caught more with hook and line, but we're keeping that study. We don't want to bias the results. So it's not that you have to take that into account that snakeheads aren't moving a lot once they set up their home range. Once they are moving downstream, like in the fall or this time of year, they might be heading downstream with the cooler temperatures. Then they'll be on the move. They're a little bit more susceptible to get caught. So. And we saw that. We saw more catches in like October, November as they were moving downstream. And then again in the spring, because they tend to go upstream in the spring when the flows come up.
Okay.
And then other years or other months, we would just get a few here and there because you're just catching what's in the local area. So some of that bias with the net is just what fish are going to be moving around in that area where we set. But that's why we do it each month, and that's why we do it across seasons, so we can remove some of that variability there.
Try to keep the variables down to a minimum as much as possible.
Yeah, right, as much as we can in nature. So
it's tough to do.
You set your nets in the same place both surveys.
Right, correct.
And that was part of the reason why you used the Blackwater Refuge survey from before, because the survey, the refuge provided the least amount of natural variables.
Right. Yeah, and it was the most amount of community data. A lot of times, states are more focused on sport fish, and that's kind of like largemouth bass surveys or catfish surveys or whatever. So this is a community data set. We were looking at all the fish. We were counting all the species that were there.
So that really made this an ideal place to conduct another survey to match the results up to.
Right, and it was as ideal as it can be. I mean, a lot of people are going to say, well, it was a long time between surveys, a lot can happen. And we can get into that, but it's the next best option. I mean, there was no other option out there. So if that data exists, I'm happy to go do a survey elsewhere, and we'll take a look. And like I said, we'll continue to monitor and see if things will change in the future. We probably won't be doing monthly sampling for the next 10 years, but we'll probably do some seasonal sampling and continue that over the next few years to monitor the situation and get a handle on what's going on, because things can change.
So before we get too deep into the results, what are some of the other variables you saw other than the introduction of snakeheads that could have affected these numbers from the other fish populations?
Well, some of the big ones are going to be, of course, 2018, we had record amount of flows. That's the big one that stands out. And that probably did have an impact. That could have been maybe why we saw less fish overall. But the one big concern is that, if it wasn't, of course, you have fluctuations with every species, right? White perch and black crappie are going to fluctuate on a year-to-year basis. But the bigger concern was that it was like across-the-board reductions. It wasn't just a species here and a species there. So that was a concern. But obviously, water quality is an issue, or could potentially be an issue. So we looked at things like salinity, water temperature, and dissolved oxygen. None of those things actually shook out as important in driving the differences that we observed. Salinity was minorly so because salinities were higher in 2006, 2007. We just didn't have as much rainfall as we did in 2018, 2019. But the more important thing was that the pattern of salinity was the same. So, most sites are typically kind of fresh in in the springtime, and then of course throughout the summer as it dries up, you're going to see that increase. The difference between 2018, of course, was that we didn't see that increase peak, at some of our more brackish water sites like upper Little Blackwater or downstream Little Blackwater and upper Blackwater. But upper Little Blackwater is mainly fresh throughout, and that pattern wasn't that, salinity was the same up there, so salinity wouldn't have influenced what we saw up there.
I think one of the biggest questions that I want to ask right now while we're talking about salinity is the salinity fluctuation that we see in that graph is not really that drastic when we talk about salinity in the water and what the fish might be able to tolerate.
Right.
A lot of guys are saying, well, I see this salt number here, and then I see the decreased population of fish. So can we blame the salt for the decrease in population?
Well, that was one
fish?
of the questions we had come in.
Okay.
Butch Huber asked. He said, "Do you think the water quality and salinity has anything to do with the data you recently shared?" So
yes, I don't think salinity does, because if salinity would impact it, we would have seen more freshwater dependent fish in 2018. Well, at least that's what I would say. Especially because high water flow, we should have seen like an increase in white perch, because typically that's good for white perch, straight bass.
The less salt, the more perch we should have seen.
Right,
that's
we would have seen less, back in 2006, 2007. Right. Now, obviously, a lot can happen with those other populations that maybe we didn't track, and there could be some other water quality factor that we didn't monitor. It could be, could be plankton was lower or something like that. But a lot of that stuff is more of a short-term kind of trend. There's one thing that's been published a lot about fish communities is that barring any kind of major disturbance, they're actually pretty stable over the long term. You get these interannual fluctuations from year to year. Species can have high abundance and then low abundance. We see that with striped bass on a year-to-year basis, but the structure of the fish community is pretty consistent. And
right.
If you look at the numbers between 2006 2007, the numbers fluctuate, but those species were the same. Like white perch was still the most abundant. We caught 11,000 white perch in 2006 and 4,000 in 2007. So that's, you might say it's a big decline, but that's where that interannual variability plays in, right? So if, for example, fast forward 2018-19, we only caught 1,000. If that was still the number one species, you'd go, all right, well, maybe it's a concern because abundances are down, but hey, it's still the number one species caught, so it suggests that, the community is still doing okay. And I think it's not anymore.
I think that's a big point from like you made earlier. From going forward, maybe not every month, but seasonally, you're going to keep track of these species from now on, that as a possibility to make sure that things are staying stable.
Right, and that's why we can't just come and sample in the spring, for example, because then you're probably going to catch more of migratory fish,
right.
And so we want to keep coming back spring, summer, fall, winter as much as we can. Winter we don't catch that much, so we might cut that out. We'll take a look and see if we need to do that, but fit in some seasonal sampling. That should give us an overall picture of how things could change, and just looking at what species are dominant.
And as far as from what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, this is the biggest snakehead survey that's being done. Is that correct? Is that what I'm understanding? I mean, Joe had said something. This is the biggest in the country that's being done. Is that?
Well, it's more like the first look at community level potential changes due to snakehead, not necessarily the biggest snakehead survey. I mean, People are doing snakehead surveys.
Right.
Although there's not, like Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. are all working with snakehead. Obviously, they have lots of other, but there's not any one dedicated snakehead person that's routinely looking at snakehead populations. So
I
think we need that. We need that. I mean, we need to have somebody at the top that's kind of coordinating this thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, almost need to. I mean, as much as the species is spread, we really need to get a better grip of exactly what they're doing to the environment.
Right, and that's why we work. We try to spread out our workforce as much as we can, or not. We don't try to spread them out, I guess. We try to work together to minimize some of that work, and we work with all the local state agencies and localities as much as we can to get a handle on that.
You guys have done a great job.
Yeah, and just like this survey, you work with Dr. Joe Love, so.
Right, yep, yeah. He did this. He was there 12 years ago as well.
The faster you gather your data, if it is a crisis, the quicker you're going to know about it.
Right, exactly, and that's why.
And so that's where the importance of getting as much as you can done as quick as you can. But I agree with these guys. You guys have done a great job. You're doing something nobody else is doing.
And I think the biggest thing here that we're seeing is the proactiveness of everybody and where we stand. You know what I mean?
And that's a big thing. The community is really coming together to catch what they can to keep that population under control until we have a better understanding of what these guys are doing to the rest of the environment.
Right, just because you caught 6 fish in a spot today that you caught 50 at last year doesn't mean that
they're disappearing.
Right.
Right, and yeah, that's why we try to sample over long periods of time. So you don't, if we just sampled once or twice and you catch a bunch of whatever fish, you might say, oh, they're doing fine. But and that's the one thing, like you guys said, we're trying to get people get out here, fish. You can capture them, eat them, kill them, and more importantly, don't move them around because Blackwater is a great example. We're seeing some changes, and we might see that elsewhere. But Blackwater is a different system than the Susquehanna. Blackwater is a different system than the Potomac. Blackwater is different than Patuxent. So they're all kind of different.
And we don't know what's going to
go when we don't know. Places, so this was the first, and we didn't know when they're in the Potomac. I mean, maybe they're doing fine there. We don't know that it could be a longer term issue there. It doesn't seem like they've had any huge impacts there, but we're also not really looking. We don't have that community level data. So, and there's actually a study mentioned in the report that did kind of a 30-year seine survey and looked at, and we got kind of similar results. I mean, they saw some increases where we didn't, like in killifish, but obviously, again, much different systems. You're talking about marsh, shallow, floodwater habitats over here in the Eastern Shore. Potomac, you got a big river.
My biggest thing about all this is I know that every river structure is different, but if you ask me, every river structure has a potential blackwater in it. You know what I mean? Like I look at other river systems. Like, for instance, Bush River, I look at the top end, I look at the marshes, I look at the swamp and the stuff around Aberdeen Proving Ground that we'll never be able to go fishing in. You know, they won't let us in there. I look at some of the areas that, we can't get boats to that guys aren't looking, like in some of the streams that are connected to some of these rivers that I've gone and I've actually looked at, and I've seen snakeheads a mile up a stream from a place on the Bush River on Route 40. So again, I think you're right. Every place is going to be different. But again, back to the whole we need to be proactive thing. We don't know what's going to happen or what could possibly happen. We're seeing what's happening here. It's got our eyebrows raised, so we really need to just keep them raised around the whole board, I think.
Right, and Blackwater's kind of unique because it's pretty small. I mean, Blackwater's smaller than most tributaries on the Potomac River. And then within Blackwater, in a relatively small river, you have such a salinity gradient, which is kind of why we have a pretty good diverse fish population out there. But that said, because the freshwater areas are pretty tiny, the snakeheads have, there's a lot of competition for that freshwater space because there are a lot of freshwater fish out here. I mean, and of course, snakeheads can tolerate some salinity, obviously, because they're out here reproducing in some kind of brackish water.
I don't mean to cut you off, but do you know exactly how much they can tolerate as far as the salinity levels?
So we've done some studies in the lab. The juveniles can seem to tolerate. They started completely dying at around 18, so that's pretty high. If you look at our water quality data from either study period, the highest I believe was like 13, and then of course over the last year didn't get that. We got like maybe around 8.
Yeah,
But yeah, so they can obviously live in that and survive in it. It's not preferred, so yeah, they are going to try to seek out that freshwater habitat when they can. But it also, there's competition for that space. So if there's enough snakeheads in freshwater habitat, they're going to start creeping down into some brackish water habitat.
So potentially, if you had a really extremely dry year and the salinity levels went way up, it could actually do more damage than. If there is damage to be done, because they're going to head to fresher water, which is farther up the rivers.
Right. It would just kind of compact all those fish in one area. And it's going to they're going to have to duke it out over space and resources.
So from your survey or your data here, what were some of the highlights of your data that you found during the comparison of the two surveys?
So one of the biggest takeaways was, I know people like to focus on the abundance data, but it was alarming at first look, right? Because obviously when you look talking about tens of thousands of fish versus now we only had, I think carp was the only thing we caught that was over 1,000, whereas 2006, 2007, we had 7 or 8 species that we caught thousands of. So that's a good sign, right? Of a healthy, you got a lot of species that can maintain high abundances. But now we saw a big reduction in that. So that was alarming. But then again, the bigger impact is the change in the order of the ranks of those species. So like I mentioned, 2006, 2007, I don't know if white perch was definitely most common, but then it was like brown bullhead, black crappie, bluegill, maybe pumpkin seed were like top 5 species. And that was the exact same order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in 2006, 2007. Now 2018, it was common carp, gizzard shad, then I think it was white perch and black crappie still. So that signifies to me that that's a potential pretty big shift in the community, because where you had a lot of those, black crappie, white perch. Those are your kind of medium-bodied fish. They're going to eat some fish during their lifetime. They're going to eat some other invertebrates, worms. They'll eat some aquatic insect larvae, that kind of thing. That was kind of that's going to control your whole ecosystem dynamics. There were still, some top predators out here, but they weren't that abundant. I mean, there were some largemouth bass, some pickerel, and things like that. You guys might know better than me, but that's kind of the two that come to mind. Obviously striped bass are here occasionally, but not all the time.
Did you see any pickerel in any of your flight study?
Not over the last year. We did catch some. We caught
before?
chain and redfin pickerel. I mean, redfin pickerel, not really a top predator. They're pretty small, but chain pickerel obviously get pretty big. We did catch some in 2006, 2007, but none over the last year.
Wow.
And we didn't catch any bass, which, again, nets are not the best to catch largemouth bass. And we know, people catch largemouth bass. We know they're here. We're not saying just because we didn't catch it, we're not saying snakehead got rid of it. But, again, the rank order, though, now that you got common carp and gizzard shad, those two things can survive on detritus. Things are decaying in the mud, which there's plenty of in Blackwater. So that tells me that maybe resources are a little bit limiting for some of those other species, maybe not allowing them to reach as high abundance levels as we saw previously.
Okay, so not to interrupt, Eddie, but while I have it on my mind, I just want to keep things fresh because I forget really easy. So one of the thoughts I had, and I've talked to some other people, and they also have had the same thought too, the increase of the shad and the carp and all that, is that a result of the loss of those medium panfish that would eat those fry, that would inhibit those numbers from getting so vast? I guess it's kind of a question. So are we losing, part of the family that's keeping this thing in balance? Are we losing this piece, which is causing this piece to get so big and look so enormous? I guess it's kind of like what my question is.
Right, and that's probably too early to say. I mean,
Okay.
it signals that could be happening, so that's why we want to continue to monitor and see if maybe this was just a one-off year and common carp, for whatever reason, were big. Okay. We know that carp were reportedly caught more, by commercial fishermen back in 2006, 2007, and they're not as reported caught more. It's mostly more white perch. Some other things here, so that maybe has something to do with it, just less fishing pressure on them. But again, it's still, you wouldn't expect that fundamental shift in the dominant species, and that's the bigger takeaway. But I just want, if we look at the literature and what's been published when other invasive species show up across the world, this is kind of what happens. You see a reduction in abundance of a lot of species. You start to see a shift in what species become a dominant because it's a species that can more coexist with snakehead or can take the disturbance in the system. Because again, I want to say we're not solely pointing the finger at snakehead. Obviously there's other things that happened. 2018 we had high floods. People are going to say water quality, could be something we didn't measure. Obviously that's always the case, but when I think about water quality, we look at kind of like land use practices and what's causing some runoff. There hasn't been a major change, in the land use around especially Blackwater, because that's mostly owned by the refuge, and we haven't really seen that around Little Blackwater. So I don't suspect that water quality plays a huge role. I was surprised that salinity didn't play more of a role, actually, because I was like, well, salinity is definitely going to shake out as something that's driving these changes, and it wasn't as important as some of the shifts in abundance.
Like you said, with the salinity levels dropping, we should have seen more of the freshwater species increase instead of decreasing.
Yeah, and some of the freshwater dependent fish that we caught in 2006, 2007, we didn't catch them. And again, it doesn't mean, we're not saying obviously there's no largemouth bass around, there's no channel cats, there's no pickerel, but what happens is, invasive species don't usually cause extinctions of other species, they cause them to get out of there. I mean, if you're getting eaten, you're going to swim somewhere else. You're going to find somewhere else to live. So
less competitive space.
Right, and if you're doing that, you're spending time not eating, you're spending time not reproducing. So that can lead to some other changes, which is why all the concern with snakehead started in the first place.
You said that the gizzard shad and the carp basically eat organic decay, roots and whatnot.
Yeah, some aquatic vegetation
right.
too. Yeah,
right. But the other species, crappie and bass and bluegills, they eat worms, bugs, whatever. Is there a way to tell if there is a decrease? Is it because the food's not there for them because it's being eaten by the snakeheads or whatever is invasive, so they can't grow because the supply of food is not there, or is it the fact that they're being eaten?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, those two things always interact with one another, so it's pretty hard to tease them apart without doing like some sort of experimental situation. So it would just be difficult, especially we can't really do it because we didn't monitor like the crappie food source. We're not looking at aquatic insects or crayfish or anything like that.
You didn't have any largemouth bass at all in any of the Fike study nuts this year.
No, and that was, I mean, we didn't catch a ton in 2006, 2007. That's why we always use the term relative abundance, right? It's not true abundance, but we caught, there were consistently, we caught like 17 one year and 18 the next year in 2006, 2007. And it's a little surprising to not see any. So that just, when we don't catch them, it just means they're someplace else, right? I mean, if they're there, they're going to hit the net and most likely swim into it. So
from what I hear, I know they were catching more up in the trans and the chick in the past year or so. So that may have been part of it. They pushed more up into those rivers instead of into the Blackwater rivers.
Yeah, and same goes with like white perch. We saw less white perch. They could have been elsewhere. And if you look, I went at the most recent striped bass seine survey data came out, and they seine a lot of areas throughout the Chesapeake Bay, and I looked at the chop tank and the Nanacoke, and since 2012, white perch, juvenile white perch counts in their seine surveys have been at or above average for both the chop tank and the Nanacoke. So you'd suspect that, Blackwater is right next door, so we should see, similar pattern, and we didn't see that this year. So that's kind of an indicator too that something else is going on. It's not just interannual.
I mean, I'm not trying to sound crazy, but I haven't caught a bass under 10 inches in 2 years. I mean, really, I haven't.
Me either.
Yeah, I mean, and things like that, that gets your antennae up a little bit. It's not like a red flag kind of thing, but that's kind of why we're interested in Blackwater, because it was like, not every report, we're not doing a whole Crofton pond every time we get a report, because we just don't have the manpower and all that. So, and they're going to spread naturally, but we monitor, and then that's why it's like 2012 is one snakehead report, and then next couple of years it's like, seems like there's a lot out there.
So you said in the future you're looking at doing seasonal studies. Do you have any plans on maybe expanding to other rivers like the Chickamauga and the Transquakin and that to see what the effects are up there maybe?
We could look into that. The only downside there is, we don't have the before data. We don't have before snakehead, so it would be more of just looking at trends to see if things shift, or we could compare it and see, is it the same kind of structure? Right. Like, what's most dominant?
I know Jimmy, they did a shocking, I can't remember, he can probably tell us more about it, but this was several years back. They did a shocking in the Transquakin. And I forget what the numbers were per area surveyed, but all those areas surveyed had bass. When they surveyed, if I remember correctly this year, there were no bass at any of the same sites that they checked, whatever that previous electroshocking was. So we'll get with him and find out, what he can tell us about that. But I do know that he did something and they tried something to do up in the Transquakin this year as far as electroshocking. I think the biggest problem with this whole electroshocking thing is we don't have the water. Is that?
Yeah. So our plan was, we didn't know how well the nets would work with snakehead, and we were surprised actually that we caught as many as we did. And we were like, well, maybe we could electrofish if we don't catch any snakehead, because we wanted to get some idea how abundant they are. But luckily we caught them in the nets to a degree, and our electrofishing boat would have a hard time getting around out there.
It's tough out here.
And I also, in the right frame of mind, understanding that the water is so shallow that the electric volts may be too much for the water. Is that?
No, you can adjust it. It's the brackish water gets hard to electrofish in. So
maybe that's what he was saying. Maybe that's what he was saying.
Yeah, you can only target the mostly fresh water. You can get into some like 2, 3, 4 parts per thousand maybe, but it's just not as effective.
Really, it should be under 2.
Well, it depends. Each boat, they're coming out with nice boats that can tolerate some more. We've had some success catching snakehead in 2 or 3 in some of the lower Potomac tribs. So with the right settings, but it's not as effective. It just works the best in freshwater.
Go ahead.
Growth rate. Am I stealing from somebody's question? Let me just look here real quick. Do we have any idea on what we're looking at as far as the growth rate goes?
Yeah, they grow pretty fast.
Mike Stewart asked that. How can we age a snakehead? Mike Stewart.
Well, so aging a fish, and it's been done with some snakehead. Bodenkirk and his Virginia staff has done some aging of otoliths, which is actually an ear bone inside the fish's skull, and you can essentially, you can kind of count the rings as if you were counting a tree ring. It takes some extra work. Yeah, right. It takes some extra work. There's some extra processing involved, but that's one way to age a snakehead, and you can also potentially use scales. It hasn't really been done much with snakehead, and odorless hasn't been done all that much, but it has been done, and it just confirms what we kind of knew from some tagging studies, that we got a handle on growth rate at least. That I think we're looking at snakehead can live 10, maybe 13 years, somewhere in that range.
That's insane.
How long does a bass live? 7?
A bass, I'm not familiar. I would guess 7, 8 years. I would be my guess.
There's no field survey.
You have to ask the bass expert.
There's no field survey we can pick him up and say, "Oh, he's."
No, you can't ask him, unfortunately. But
we can make a rule in 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year. No.
You can kind of guess when they're small, when they're young. So if you get like an 8 to 12 incher, that's probably about a year. They can grow about 8 inches that first year of life. And of course, that varies. And then after that, about 4 inches a year. So you're looking at 16 inches for maybe a 2-year-old. Once you get to about 24 inches, though, that's when it looks like it could be 4 years old. It could be 8 years old.
Yeah, one of the independents that I talked to, he's been doing scale sampling, and that's what he's gauging is 8 to 14 inches in a year.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying
that's really fast.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what a lot of the growth is here is what they're being fueled with what they're eating.
Oh, sure, yeah. They eat fish as soon as, probably like 4 or 5 months. I mean, I've caught, when we see a school of juveniles, they're not eating fish. Usually they're eating aquatic insect larvae when they're all schooled up. But once they break up and they get to be about 4 to 6 inches long, I found fish in their guts. They're eating whatever tiny little minnows they get their hands on.
Just like in a tournament, I don't think it matters what size their prey is either, because like in a tournament, how big was Alex's fish?
28 inches.
28 inches, and the fish that was in his gut was 18, wasn't it?
16.
16 or
He was
something.
28 and 16.
That's
and
insane.
that's definitely on the upper end. I think one of the biggest things I've seen was like a 10-inch catfish, and but most fish are going to go. They're not size limited. I mean, they do swallow their fish whole, but although the biggest thing I think I pulled out was it was about a 20-inch eel, and that was kind of cooled up in the gut. So there's a lot more room for eels.
So while we're talking about guts, I wanted to get into this, so we might as well touch on it now. Now, Ricky, my cousin, he had one. Remember that fish? It was 16 pounds and had a 21.5-inch channel catfish in its stomach. Literally. Yeah, I got the picture of it. I'll show you. But while we're talking about eating and stuff like that, a lot of these guys, they take their fish home and they clean the fish, and there's nothing in the stomach. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these guys, they're not eating that. They can't be eating that much because everyone I take home doesn't have anything in its stomach. So I guess the question is, we caught them because they were hungry,
right?
Because they had an empty stomach.
Well, and they don't grow to be nearly 20 pounds and 30 inches long by eating nothing. So they're eating something.
Right.
It takes a lot of food actually to grow that fast.
How long does it take their stomach to clear itself?
That's just it. So I think they digest pretty quick.
I heard.
That's part of it. When we do a gut content study, I think in our study out here in Blackwater, out of the 130 or so fish, I think 70% of them were empty. Some of that's related to time of day too. So if you catch them early in the morning, they haven't really started feeding yet, because they're most active during daylight hours. And there's during the Snakehead Symposium last year, there was a good gut content study, and most of them come up empty. That's not that happens with all fish. It
makes sense. They're not going to be chasing food unless they're hungry.
Right, and they don't eat. They're not just sitting there eating all day, every day either.
Right. So like I talked to the guys, during the seasons, and you just said it a couple minutes ago, you saw more fish come here in the spring into the nets, right? Okay. So, I talked to the guys during the summer, man, I'm struggling, man. There's fish everywhere. They're not biting. So I guess my thing is, I think that some of these times these guys are getting the fish off fry balls and things like that. The parents aren't necessarily eating, you know what I mean?
Right.
They're just trying to keep something away from the fry until the fry are gone, then they eat. Is that how I understand?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't eat much that they're trying to right before they spawn, there's kind of like a gorging period that's been kind of confirmed.
Right.
And then after they spawn, they'll guard, so if you could see a fry ball, you might be able to get one.
Realistically, what my point is here is that through 8 months of the year, you're going to have a better chance of seeing nothing in the stomach than something in the stomach. You know what I mean? So to see the stomach contents through the summer, we got to catch that fish in between the spawns on the feed, getting ready to go again. Right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So hopefully that helps to answer or to let some of these people understand why they may be taking the snake at home and there's nothing in its stomach. First of all, they process the food so fast. You know what I mean? Second of all, if they're spawning and they're not eating or anything like that, you're not going to see anything. So I think that has a lot to do with it. For me personally, I got check a lot of my fish, and in the spring and in the fall, I would have to say for me, 50% plus have stomach contents.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, I've got tons of pictures. I mean, yellow perch and just, I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of gut shots, you know. So I don't know. I just, I guess that was my question. You know, during the spawns, you know, people have asked me several times, well, you know, are they eating? No, they're not eating. They're protecting the fry. That's why the stomach's empty. You know what I mean? So I don't know.
While we're on the subject of stomach contents and diet, Gary, you've got a question from Alex Little.
Yeah, Alex Little asks, he says, we have already seen cannibalism, parents eating the young like a bluefish frenzy. Is this because they're already very low in food sources in the Blackwater?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that was probably my gut is to say that's probably not necessarily why. We found them in the Potomac too, and you know, resources aren't necessarily as limited in there as they would be over here. They just cannibalize one another.
So it's not something localized to the Blackwater.
Yeah, when we were doing some of the salinity work with juveniles, if you get one that grows fast, you're going to come in the next day and you're going to have it's going to be missing some brothers and sisters because they're growing fast. I mean, they're growing 8 inches a year, so they're going to eat what's in front of their face when they're hungry, and if that just happens to be a snakehead, they'll eat it.
We've seen it in the tournaments of larger ones. I mean, you're talking 18, 20, 22-inch with 4 or 5, 6 fry right in its mouth when it's caught. So.
Oh, yeah, the one Alex brought in, remember? It had literally, God,
falling out of the gills.
Its gills were just, they were stuck in the points of the gills, you know?
Yeah.
It ate that many, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's probably not necessarily because other things that are depressed necessarily, but... It might have been hungry, and that's what was there.
Big, right. and I mean, literally the fry that was.
It wasn't like an older brother or sister. This was a big.
Right. Yeah.
You're talking 24, 26.
He was coming down the line, saw a square, and said, "Nah, man, this is my river. I'm eating in here, not you."
Somebody already caught the parents off the fry ball. Yeah, you're talking about the fry balls. When you do catch them off fry balls, if you catch one. It's hard to catch that second one a lot of times, and they'll smack the lure. I mean, they will not bite it. They'll smack it out of the way.
I've said it 100 times. I mean, this fish is incredibly brilliant. I mean, as far as intelligence,
I mean,
it has a level of intelligence that I don't see in the other fish. You know, like it has a brain that almost like it thinks. You know what I mean?
So on to some other questions. We have Mike Head here. He was asking. Once discovered by electroshock, are they considered established, or how do you consider them as established in an area?
Well, if they are discovered by electrofishing, there's probably a good chance they are established. Established means that there's a self-reproducing population there. So, you know, when you hear like a one-off report in some odd location that they're not likely to survive, we wouldn't necessarily consider that established. But once you get continued reports and you get different size classes, then you can say, yeah, they're established. And that's kind of why we say 2004 was the Potomac. They were established there, but obviously they were before. So the chances that you caught the one in an area is pretty slim to none. So if you catch them, whether it's through fishing or electrofishing, there's a good chance they are established at that point. Unfortunately,
I guess while we're talking about the establishment, the reproduction cycle. How many times do we think that these fish are reproducing here?
That's the $1 million question, right? We still don't have confirmation of a single fish spawning in May, June, and then spawning again later that year, because that would involve, hey, I caught this fish ready to spawn, I got to let it go and then catch it again. And the chances of that happen are really slim. That said, it seems like they're at least capable of maybe doing 2. But some of that's going to depend on the weather. So if you had a warm spring and then you go into a warm fall as well, that might prolong that spawning period. You can kind of you definitely see 2 peaks of when juveniles appear, and that's kind of that early summer, June, July, depending on water temperature, and then again maybe August, September. Out here, I will say it seemed like there was there's a couple other ones you see. Or it's one prolonged one. That's the other possibility, is that just get multiple snakeheads spawning kind of throughout that time frame. So that's the other potential explanation there. But like last year, I think in October, November, this was in like 8 parts per thousand. We caught some juvenile snakehead that were clearly only
That's why I want to ask this question, because in February and then January,
I remember this. Yep.
I had guys here sending me pictures that were minnowpotting with 2.5, maybe 3-inch snakeheads. So my question was this. I know I saw fry balls last year at in November.
Mm-hmm. That could be those fish overwintering. I mean, they're not going to grow much over the winter just because food's
because they're not
limited.
eating as much.
Yeah, so that's why you might see
So that
if they can survive. And
Well, that was our main question because we weren't sure if that was another spawn. Maybe.
Yeah.
I wouldn't think
late
so
winter.
because I don't think they're not spawning until that water temperature is nice. So it's probably a holdover from like the last spawn. Maybe that was October.
See, that's what we were trying to figure. We knew we had some kind of a spawn in November.
Yeah,
was it possible because this fish was this small? If there was something in December, looking at a 2-month-old, looking at a graph and what this should be.
Right.
I mean, that was telling us, hey man, maybe something happened in December.
Yeah, probably not, but it's probably just a holdover because it's probably older at that size than it normally would be.
So what are what's the earliest you've seen snakeheads where they've reached sexual maturity?
They can do it at about 2 years old. I mean, we've seen eggs and fish as small as 14 and 16 inches. So yeah, that was kind of concerning too when the first one we cut up in the Potomac. Like, whoa, this is
technically,
early.
if these fish are growing 8 to 14 inches here in a year, then they could be sexually mature a year here.
Maybe. It depends. It takes a lot of energy again to put into eggs. So they're probably not necessarily developing those ovaries and stuff that early. It could happen, but I would definitely 2. We know 2 is possible. And that could be a size thing. So if they're growing, for whatever reason, they grow faster here, because some fish, they become sexually mature when it's a certain size. So if that's the case with snakehead, we don't know. But if it is, and they happen to grow that fast that early,
is anybody doing any kind of looking at the bass population at all?
Well, of course, the state of Maryland has their bass surveys, and they're in those surveys are conducted over time in a lot of areas with snakehead. So they're working at it and looking at bass. Of course, we don't have those out here at Blackwater. But
Okay, that was my question.
most those are all
here.
Those are all electrofishing surveys. I think they have some sites in the Pocomoke would probably be, and maybe the Chop Tank and the Nanacoke. I think.
And they did the upper chop tank up around Denton and all.
So yeah, the state probably has some data on bass populations there. And from what I've seen, I don't think we're not seeing a huge decline across the bay, but I don't want to speak on behalf of the state there because I'm not
right.
not
Understand.
doing that.
Understand.
Oh, we got a question, or actually got a couple questions from Chris Schizler. He says we'd like to know what noticeable patterns have developed in other species of panfish and stripers competing for the same breeding grounds that snakeheads have populated. Is nature effectively resolving some of the concerns about overpopulation of snakeheads?
Well, that one's a tough one because especially we can't really answer the striper question out here in Blackwater because we just don't catch that many. They're not that abundant. You can look to like the striped bass seine survey data, and of course that's usually bay wide, and you can look at some of the local rivers now. I looked at white perch. I didn't look at what striped bass were doing on local rivers recently, but I'm not so much worried about striped bass. A lot of their life cycle doesn't overlap that much. The young don't spend a ton of time here. I'm sure if a snakehead encounters a juvenile striped bass, it would take a shot at it, but I haven't found any. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened, and I'm sure it would on occasion. But again, where snakeheads are abundant, that's usually not where the striped bass are spawning, so I'm not too concerned with that. In terms of other panfish, luckily bluegills are pretty hardy. Actually, it was one of the lakes where snakehead have shown up in Virginia. Was another study that Odenkirk and his crew published, and they didn't see any decline in bluegill in their electrofishing surveys, and snakeheads were largely eating bluegills. So bluegills can spawn, pretty much all summer. They'll lay a nest, and snakeheads probably love that because I found I think upwards 10 to 20 juvenile bluegills in the guts because
year-round food
again,
source.
yeah, right. So, but then in terms of the trends of those species. We can't really answer that question. We can give you what we did in our surveys here, and we saw reduction in most of those, but not on a year-to-year basis. That's another one of those things where not everybody's looking at it. Unfortunately, that data just doesn't really exist. So.
Not yet.
Right.
Hadn't been enough time to gather it all, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, while we're talking about stripers, before we go into something else, we're hearing the talk around the bay of the striper decline. We're not seeing this. We're not seeing that. So, I'm talking to some friends, some of the guys up there on the western shore, Butch Boyd up there, West Side Snake, stuff like that. I've been talking to them guys about a lot of things because he fishes the Susquehanna a lot. Now, I know that the Susquehanna is a huge nursery for rockfish, the flats and everything. I also understand that the juvenile fry utilize the flats, grass, as their home until they are of size to migrate up the rivers to get their next growth spurt.
Right.
I look at the design of a snakehead and I look at the design of a largemouth bass, and I start thinking about something. I start seeing something that reminds me of a pig with a snoot that can just root through anything that it wants to. Okay, so I guess my question is some people have asked me, do I think that there is any decline in the striped bass population because of the introduction of the amount of snakeheads that they are seeing on the flats now? And if those snakeheads going to the juvenile fry by the hundreds that are eating small stuff, could that be playing a role in this striper gig?
I don't think yet. I don't think so, but it's obviously the flats is becoming a good snakehead hotspot as well, and vegetation adds to that, right? So it increases survival of juvenile snakehead fry as well. And it's again mostly kind of fresh most years, especially over the last year. So, and that's also the hotspot where they're spreading throughout the northern part of the bays, probably coming from the Susquehanna Flats and areas like that.
And the reason I ask is I had a friend last year, and I'm going to the end of the summer, and I want to say it was late July, August, somewhere in that time. The snakeheads that they were harvesting off the flats, tons of yellow perch like this, tons of striped bass like this, tons of little catfish like this. So I think that's kind of why that question kind of came up, because there was a couple guys last year when that hit Facebook were like, "Holy crap!"
Right? No, that's that's one of these concerns, right? That's why we don't want people to move them around. They can move around just as good on their own, actually. If they become abundant, that's one thing. That's where they could have an impact in a lot of these areas, and that's a whole different environment, right? You're not even really a river system up there. You're just at a vegetated flat.
Okay. Right. Another question is, we know some of these guys are transporting them to some of the impoundments, around Baltimore County and things like that, Lock Raven, Liberty, places like that. Are you guys looking at any of those places, or is that something the state looks at, or who watches those reservoirs and those freshwater impoundments?
It's done between both, us and the states, of course. Okay. Virginia actually did catch the guy who stocked one of their lakes. They charge him with whatever misdemeanor, whatever it was. So
misdemeanor, my ass. No,
yeah. Well, the states luckily are finally, the fine didn't used to be that high. It used to be $50 and go on your way. So it's still a concern. I mean, obviously we don't want people to do it, and this is exactly why. So because then, of course, it becomes when it does become a problem, then you'll be knocking on the door too, saying, "Hey, can you do something about this?" And once it becomes a problem, it's hard to do something about it. It's really hard. And look at Blackwater. We don't have a lot of good ways to get in there and control them.
There's literally nothing we can do at this point except for just fish them as hard as we can.
Yeah, and in the Potomac, we've been encouraging that, and occasionally we see some declines. I looked at that and some of our Potomac data, and where we were doing some tagging, trying to get a handle on how many people were fishing, and it takes a lot of effort before you start to see a decline. So obviously, like I go back to how I started. If you're catching 5 or 6 in the same spot day after day, that's a sign that there's probably a lot there.
Now, not to jump all around, but I'm having a couple thoughts. I know we're getting close to being at the end, and I want to try to get these questions in before we're done. You were talking about this wing wall, or in the beginning of your conversation, that was installed in the.
Oh yeah, the weir, the upper, on the upper Blackwater.
So this weir that was installed, what was the reasoning behind installing this weir again?
So the upper part of the Blackwater River used to. There was a canal dug. It was for logging, and so they dug that canal, which connects with the Little Chop Tank, I believe, and that was allowing saltwater intrusion, which was killing the freshwater marsh. So the idea was, let's install this weir. It's a one-way weir where the saltwater ideally can't come in and the freshwater can go out. Now, at really high floods, saltwater can still get around, but we did see a return of some river herring over the last year. Not many, but we caught some, whereas we didn't catch that many in 2006,
So the reason for the installation of the weir was to improve the water quality and to
improve
help
the freshwater habitat.
Yeah. Okay. And the results from that seen so far are pretty good from what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it's, I don't think it's working on a marsh level yet. Obviously, it's going to take a while for that to happen, but it takes a long time for that salt water essentially to leach out of the mud and get flushed out. So,
just trying to see if there's anything else.
Got one more question. Chris Schizler's second question. He says, have you heard or witnessed accounts of bluegills moving in to decimate a fry ball soon after the protective parents were caught off the nest? Is this common, and do bass or perch do the same thing?
Yeah, I've seen it firsthand. We were electrofishing. We got I remember we got 1 or 2 adults off, but we hung out. I think we were checking gut contents of the fish right there on the boat, and I just happened to look over, and I didn't even know they were snakehead fry. They were so tiny. I mean, you're talking like less than a half an inch. They were you couldn't even tell there was a color pattern. And then I just sat there and watched. These were mosquito fish. I don't know if you know what mosquito fish are. They're only like an inch long. They just started coming in, picking them off, and I cut it in one mosquito fish, and it had like 8 of these fry in it. And then I didn't know what the fry were until I got back to that. I was like, oh, that's a snakehead fry. Wow. So it happens. That's why we really encourage that. That's a great population control, because once they're not guarded, I mean, they stick out like a sore thumb. They're kind of orange,
easy
green,
pickings, right?
And bass, bluegill, a lot of fish will come in and pick them off.
Birds. Question: I thought about this last year. Do you think that there'll ever be some way that they'll have a bounty where you could actually go out and
we already did
dip
that.
up?
It didn't work. We didn't do that. Didn't work out right. We were all getting paid too much.
Yeah, the story goes, Bass Pro encouraged that back in the day because, of course, bass were a big concern, hurting the bass fishery. Then I think somebody showed up on their doorstep with thousands or whatever it was, hundreds, and said, "Hey, where's my money?" Whatever it was, $20, $50 a pop. I don't know. But that was before
we did that.
I remember that.
It might have been us that
so
told
it's like,
because we wanted to get paid. We were like, "Hold on, bro. We've been fishing for 4 days, man. We need some money."
That's why the states and Virginia's on board now too. You can commercially sell them there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's.
I was just talking about for fry.
Right.
Where they had like a fry bounty where you could go out,
goodness.
and you do them by the gallon or whatever. You wouldn't be able to. Nobody's going to count them.
Yeah, I think that would just be too difficult. I don't see the bounty program.
Well, the problem is you got to kill them before you bring them in. That would be, pack them from formaldehyde or something.
So the current laws right now, and I have one more question from Mr. John Hostocko, and he's a good guy. He's a big snakehead fisherman. But how do you explain the differences in the findings between these studies? Blackwater, Love, Potomac, Odenkirk.
Well, but they're just 2 entirely different systems. Like I said, many times, Blackwater, shallow, tidal marsh system. Some of that kind of habitat exists in the Potomac, but you're talking about a river that is over 120 miles, and that's just in the tidal portion. Let's just say, fish. If we saw the exact same thing happen in a Potomac River tributary, there's a good chance that fish from a nearby tributary are going to come by and repopulate it. That kind of stuff happens all the time. That's why getting rid of snakeheads in the Potomac would be hard. Maybe we could really focus our efforts on reducing population in one tributary, but in the next year you're going to start getting all those ones coming from another tributary. So they're just 2 entirely different systems, and that's why showing up in the Susquehanna, the impacts are probably going to be different. Now they're in like Octoraro and Deer Creeks. They're not tidal. So
Otter
we're
Creek,
looking at streams,
Bush Creek,
and we're looking at streams with some rare species like Chesapeake log perch. So concerned about that. So it's just 2 entirely different systems. Anytime you're comparing studies, you can't compare the results if they're not in the same area. And the Potomac stuff is large. It's based on electrofishing, so there's different biases with gear types.
Right.
Their sampling strategy is different. It's not year round. So that's just why the difference is. So that's, again, I know it's terrible to say we don't know what's going to happen because we don't know. I mean, it's not the best message in the world, but this is why. Just because we don't see something dramatic happen in one area doesn't mean that's not going to happen, in an area like we're seeing now in Blackwater. So
we have one more question. Jim Petro was asking, he said, if you guys have tagged snakehead, how far have you found them spreading?
So pretty far. That was kind of it's interesting. So 85% of the ones we tagged did not move. They don't move from the same creek where they were tagged. They might move, a little bit based on location. Not that we have fine-tuned GPS locations on them, but we had one, the biggest one, I believe it went from Aquia Creek, if you're familiar with the Potomac, that's kind of lower Potomac, a little bit north of 301 Bridge. It left there and was recaptured by an angler fishing up at Chain Bridge, so it's outside D.C.
Oh, wow.
So I did the math. I forget exactly how far it was total, but it was, and just between the days, it moved at about a mile a day.
That's insane.
So yeah, that's they can move far and fast, the ones that want to get around, and it's no surprise. Look at how they've spread around Blackwater, right? I mean, you got all these interconnected ditches and waterways. So when it floods, they love that kind of habitat. So that's why they spread so much over here. And it's just tough to fish, as you guys know. You can't get in any area.
There's places that we will never see here.
Yeah.
Well, no, I said it before. I mean, 2016. I don't recall seeing any kayak fishermen ever. We'd see, you totally see people in Key Wallace, but. Now you go during the summer, you'd see 10 kayakers.
I've said this a lot of times. There's more people that have seen the upper Blackwater River in the last 3 years that I have in the last 100 years.
Well,
That's exactly right.
I'll tell you what.
I spent a many day back there and never saw anybody.
And look.
I haven't been there one time this year that doesn't see 5 to 10 people.
And look, we can thank all three of us.
That's right.
Right? So.
I'm sure some people aren't thanking us.
Oh,
for it.
no, a lot of people now. I've had a lot of death threats this year, that's for sure. Yep. Okay, so one more big question before we get done.
Uh-oh.
Do snakeheads hibernate?
That's we tried to do that in the lab. I don't think they hibernate. It's not full blown hibernation, and so I have a couple theories on why I think that. For one, we tried to do it in the lab. We tried to get we brought in mud, we stuck it outside in the cold, let it get iced over. Actually, we killed the snakehead, but it's funny working with them really hard. They actually don't like captivity. They get fungused up. Anyway, so that one didn't really seem to burrow in the mud. Now, granted, it could have been stressed from captivity. The other side is we've gone out, like we've gotten a few, you get those 70-degree December days. My guess is you could probably go hook and line fishing. We can go fishing, and I think they can hunker down when it's cold, and their metabolism goes way down. It's not a full-blown hibernation like some fish do. And then I think they get that warm day, and they can snap out of it and come eating, because we've sampled when it's really cold, and you won't catch them until you find that they tend to find like a nice deep hole, and around here maybe that's 3-4 foot, but if it's nice muddy, they can kind of get down in the mud. We can shock them up out of the mud, but then when we're shocking in a nice warm winter day, they're up in the water column swimming around.
That's been our exact theory, is that they just kind of go into a semi-hibernation. They slow their metabolism down.
It's not like they're totally shut down.
Like I tell the people here, like we get the question all the time. I have guys coming every week and they'll reach out to me like, dude, I know it's freezing cold. Dude, is there any way I can catch one? And I'm telling them where to go. I mean, what I have seen in the winter is this. I think personally myself that they school up by size. They kind of hang in that same size class, and they stay together in a group. That's kind of what I think. I've watched them. I've sat on Newbridge and watched them like a pot of porpoises.
Right, that's probably a deep hole.
Work an entire school of gizzard shad together and then just rip apart and then do it again, come back together almost. That's why I say these fish are brilliant. I've seen them do things that people haven't seen them do,
Yeah, and out here, when you get that warm winter day, that water warms up pretty quick. So
that's what I've told people.
Yeah, so they can...
If that tide's low and that mud flat's out of the water and that sun's up hitting that mud, I don't care if it's 30 degrees out. It's still going to get warmer than freezing.
Water will get up to 50 quick.
And then that water come in, roll over that 30-degree water into 50-degree mud. Now you got 42 degrees and you've triggered a feeding frenzy. My next question, this will be the last one, I promise. How long do we need from a wake-up period to spawn?
What do you mean, like?
So here I am. It dropped down into 32 degrees, and it's been 32 degrees in the water for a week, and it's been cold. Now here comes February. I've got 10, 55, 60-degree days coming, or let's just say 6. Now
probably not going to spawn. Yeah,
so it wouldn't be fast enough to do it. Okay, now I just want to ask that question because I've had guys say to me, "Well, all you'd have to do is let the water get warm for 2 days, and they'll go to work, bro." I'm like, dude, look, man, if I've been sleeping for 4 days, it's going to take more than 2 days for me to go to work. You know what I'm saying?
They need to start eating, start feeding, start putting that energy into.
So they need to get back into the routine, right? Okay, so they just can't wake up, do it, and have babies.
Right.
It's probably going to take them a month or so to get ready.
I would assume it. Yeah, at least a few weeks.
The earliest five I've ever seen is late April. That's the earliest.
Yeah, I was going to say that's why you don't see it, and that was probably a warm March or something. And it's not uncommon to get a warm March. 50, 60 in February. It's just probably not quite warm enough.
They don't do any radio. I just can't put a collar on a fish, but there's no radio sensors or anything they put on them where you can tell if they migrate more when it rains. Because they're Asian.
Yeah.
And with the monsoons.
There've been studies. Yep. Yeah. There was a study done in Potomac. Well, and a couple different studies. We did one, and there was Nick LaPointe. He did some of his, I think it was PhD work on. Did the same. You can put radio tags on them. You can kind of track them. And yeah, they do move more. They're in our study and his. There's kind of this early spring movement pattern. Then they kind of settle back down for most of the summer and fall.
So I know I've heard a lot of people say when you see a lot of rain,
right? Yeah,
they see them cross roads and whatever.
Yeah, they tend to move around more, and that's how we also know they're more active during daylight. The little radio tag has a motion sensor on it, and during the day or nighttime, they're mostly sitting still, and that's why the bow hunters, of course, can have a little bit more success. Right. But yeah, no, those tags do exist. So that's actually one I think I mentioned at Chain Bridge was that one wasn't from Aquia, but that one had been radio tagged. So
Some really good information.
Yeah, man.
You can track them, but you can get right on top of them, but you still can't always catch them.
That's the truth. I think everybody's experienced that.
Hey, if Stick of Dynamite does a job every day for me. No, I'm just kidding. I don't do that.
Josh, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so, guys. Thanks for having me on.
We're so grateful you
keep
came,
on
man.
Catching them and eating them.
This has been fantastic. We really appreciate you coming on.
I appreciate it.
Gary, you have anything else to add?
No, that's all. Just want to compliment you guys. Are doing a great job.
Kaz?
Can we sing some Christmas carols before we go?
No, thank you.
Okay.
All right, guys. For Josh, Gary, Kaz, and myself, thank you all for watching. This has been episode 6. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.